Hi, I'm Dylan Paris. I'm a musician, a YouTuber, and today I am coming at you not from my normal setup. I'm filming on an iPhone and an iPad, and I think that's appropriate because today I want to talk about the iPad Pro 2021, the M1 model, and specifically about how I feel like it's kind of a letdown. And I want to talk about my own journey with it, which if you've been following my channel, you know is pretty weird. But basically, when Apple announced the M1 iPad Pro, they made it sound like it was going to be essentially an M1 MacBook in a tablet, which would have been amazing. And I was extremely excited about this because I really liked the power of the M1 MacBook Airs and MacBook Pros, but I thought the idea of having that on an iPad would mean that we would get things like Final Cut or Logic Pro, different pieces of software that would actually take advantage of this machine. And so I went all in. And a lot of people will tell you this, I will repeat this, do not buy products based on what you think they might do in the future. Buy them based on what they do when you get them. I didn't do this. I bought my iPad Pro, I pre-ordered it before WWDC would have revealed iPadOS 15. And because of this, by the time they actually revealed iPadOS 15, I was not able to return mine because I bought it directly from Apple. I bought the 11-inch, 16 gigs of RAM, 1 terabyte SSD iPad Pro. This iPad Pro, the one I'm filming with right now. And honestly, I've been pretty disappointed. I think everyone who bought these in the anticipation of iPadOS 15 was severely disappointed. If you bought one after, you at least knew what you were getting into. And what you were getting into is an iPad with way, way more power than it needs. Like, we just don't know why it has so much power. Because 16 gigs of RAM is so much more than any application is taking advantage of right now, even after the launch of iPadOS 15. It's such a disappointment because we know it could be so much more. I had an M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch for a couple of months before the 16-inch M1 Pro came out, and that machine only had 8 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage, but it could run Ableton and it could run Logic and it could run Final Cut and it could do a bunch of things that this iPad should be able to do, but simply can't because Apple refuses to support it with software. And because Apple refuses to support it with software, it also doesn't have third-party apps really that can take advantage of this. Now, there are a few exceptions. If you're an iPad music producer, and if you're watching this, you probably are, you know that there are a bunch of amazing apps on iPad. But the thing about most of those apps is that they can run on phones, and they can run on the base model iPad. There really isn't a reason to get an iPad Pro just for those apps. You might want some more RAM, but most of those apps have to be written to take advantage of most of this hardware. Because if they're only targeting really specific niche high-end devices, they're really limiting their audience. Now, you could make an argument that the people who buy the really expensive niche hardware are the same people who would be willing to buy expensive niche apps. And I would make that argument. But I also understand they need to support a lot of hardware to give a lot of people the option and ability to buy their applications. And so because of this, we're in a situation in which the iPad is an amazing value on paper. For the hardware that you're buying, it's pretty cheap. But because the software is so limited, it kind of feels not worth it. For the things I use my iPad for most of the time, I could easily get away with a 2018 iPad Pro. And I would have saved a lot of money. This was a $1,500 iPad when I bought it. And the thing is, originally I tried to replace it with a 12.9-inch iPad. I have a video about this. The 12.9-inch iPad is actually really cool. It has a mini LED screen and some more technologies in it that make it feel like a next generation leap. However, it's much larger and it doesn't have the portability factor that I love in the 11-inch. It is a better reading device in some ways. And because of the mini LED screen, it's also a better movie consumption device. But for music creation, I actually like the form factor of the 11-inch because it's so much more portable. And when you're holding it, it doesn't feel super heavy the way that the 12.9-inch, especially this year's one, does. Now, the reason I didn't keep the 12.9-inch is actually because I couldn't find anyone who wanted to buy this thing for a reasonable price. Literally weeks, maybe a couple months, but I don't even think it was multiple months. Weeks after I bought this thing, the highest offers I was getting in the aftermarket here in town were about $1,000. Now, I know sunk cost is a fallacy. I say this all the time on my channel, but going from a $1,500 purchase and immediately losing $500 just felt wrong. And so I actually ended up selling the 12.9-inch because I bought it used. I sold it for only a little bit less than what I bought it for, and I kept the 11-inch. And the 11-inch has treated me well, don't get me wrong. But again, basically everything I've done on this thing you could do on last year's model or even a 2018 model. Apps like Beatmaker 3, GarageBand, LumaFusion 3.0. These are apps I know run well on other devices. As far as 16 gigs of RAM go, this one is 16. The 12.9 inch I had 8. And I will say that apps just remain in RAM on this iPad Pro basically forever. That can be really cool because it means you could not be using an app for weeks and then go back to it, and then it's just there waiting for you, which is awesome. It can also kind of be a negative. I've actually noticed when trying to use remote play apps or streaming apps that because everything is retained in memory, it actually seems like those wireless connections are continuing, but that could just be conjecture, I don't know. But when I close those apps, it does seem like remote play and streaming and things like that actually work better. So that could be true. Anyway, for me, right now, the iPad Pro is just in a really weird place. And I know it's always kind of been true that you could get a lot of storage, but this is the first generation where you can get a lot of RAM. And so far, Apple has shown no reason to buy this. Now, I've had people in my comments say, well, I feel good about buying the 16 gig one because in the future, it'll be able to do a bunch of stuff. And I just don't think that's ever actually a really good reason to buy anything. And here's why. In the future, this one will be cheaper, like a lot cheaper. Like it's already $1,000 instead of $1,500, right? And that's just a couple months. And it still has nothing that takes advantage of that RAM. So let's say it's a year from now, they announce an even fancier one. The 11 inch has a mini LED screen. The base model is still 8 gigs, 16 gigs of RAM are available. Now there's a software update and Logic Pro's here and Final Cut's here. Or maybe that's in a year after, right? Maybe that's 2023. In either of those situations, this iPad will probably run all those apps. It won't have the nicer screen, but it will run those apps. And it'll be even cheaper, right? It could be $800, $700 for this one I got used. In that situation, the person like me who paid $1,500 for this and waited 2 years or a year to actually use that hardware is at a severe disadvantage to the person who buys from someone like me, pays $1,000 or less, and then gets the same benefits at the same time. And so that is my counter argument to it makes sense to buy stuff because of what it will be. Because these are not appreciating devices, right? All of this technology depreciates. And Apple technology depreciates slower than, in my experience, Android and PC hardware, but it's never gonna appreciate. This is not a teenage engineering OP1 in 2018. This is a cyclically replaced and upgraded piece of hardware. And it does not have anything that I've seen that justifies its increased cost yet. And so after almost a year, or at least, the life of this thing this year, I can wholeheartedly say there's no reason right now. If you're like me, editing video, creating music, capturing the screen while you're creating music, if you're doing all of this, you can do it on last year's model. And you could do it on the 8 gig version of this year's model. If you had to have a 2021 M1 MacBook Pro, or iPad Pro rather, I would say you should get the 8 gig version. And you should check out the 12.9 because that screen tech is really cool. And you can get a used one of those for pretty cheap now. If you have to have an 11 inch iPad Pro, I just really think you should probably just get a 2020 model, or maybe even a 2018, unless you have found specific workloads and use cases that those devices cannot handle. I haven't, but that doesn't mean they don't exist because I certainly don't know everything. But in my experience, it just makes no sense to buy this device right now. But I do get a lot of questions. I thought you sold that. Why are you still using it? And for me, it's actually similar to the Machina Plus, although I actually use the Machina Plus a lot still as I do this. But it's a similar situation in that I paid $1,500. If I sell it for $1,000 or less, I lose $500 in less than a year in depreciated value. If I keep it and use it and get something out of it, then it feels less bad than just I sold it, swapped it out, and lost a bunch of money. In the future, I'm gonna hold off. I'm not going to buy an iPad like this again if it doesn't have a clear and easy to convey value proposition for why you would upgrade. I have the M1 Pro MacBook Pro 16 inch, which is just amazing. It's a beast. I've got my iPhone 13 Pro here filming and my 11 inch iPad Pro 2021 with the beefiest specs. And I'm good, Like, it'd be cool if more things took advantage of this, but this is a nice little hardware ecosystem. And I am excited to see what happens next. But I don't think you should buy this thing. And that's all I'm saying. So, I hope you have a great week ahead. Consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed the video. For those of you who have already, I appreciate you so much. Seriously, this channel is over 3,600 subscribers now or something, which is just ludicrous. And that's because of you. So thank you so much. I'll catch you soon. Have a great week.